Hey guys, okay, in today's chapter, things sort of change as far as how the story is told. So now the narrator is going to start telling us things in her own words, not so much in story form as it has been so far. So I remember the first time that I read this book, it kind of confused me because suddenly we go from reading a story with dialogue from the characters, and then all of a sudden the narrator starts talking and telling her perspective. So this is when that happens, and then the rest of the book follows in this similar format with dialogue sprinkled in. And then beyond that, it's sort of just random memories that Sarah, or whom her descendants call Elizabeth, shares. So as she ages, she kind of goes in and out of memories and will just start talking about them. And her granddaughter, Nora Whitaker, jots down these random memories that she tells her and put them in this book. So we're going to start to get to that point. It might kind of seem like it's all over the place, but it's still nonetheless very interesting, and it still has yet to tell some big parts of her story. So to sum it up, I feel like the actual story, which is chapters 1 through 17, seems to mostly focus on my great-great-grandpa, her son, little Will. It's all about her life up until that point. And then everything beyond the story is just an interview, her talking about all of her life beyond that. So there's still a lot of big things that happen to her, but they're no longer going to be told in story form. There will be a little bit of dialogue here and there, so I hope it doesn't get confusing, but that's just the way the author chose to tell this story. So anyways, having said all of that, let's go ahead and get started. Chapter 18, Centerville in its early days. Sarah loved Centerville from the very first. This was home. The first home she had really felt to be hers, to keep. Here at last she felt she could put down her roots and become a part of this dear place, situated between the town of Bountiful on the south and Farmington on the north. Actually, Centerville had been started in the spring of 1848 by Thomas Grover and Osmond M. Duell, with William Duell, brothers. They planted crops and built 3 homes. Other families soon followed. The Shadrach Roundies, with 2 married sons, Thomas J. Thurston, and then others. There are 4 main streams flowing from the mountains east toward the Great Salt Lake westward. They called them Duell Creek, Parish Creek, Bernard Creek, and Ricks Creek, and they are about 1/2 mile apart. As early as 1851, the first schoolhouse was built near Parish Creek. The first teacher was John S. Gleason. The settlement was first called Duell Settlement, after the Duell brothers. Later, for a short time, it was called Cherry Creek Settlement, after the Cherry family who settled there. Then, finally, it was officially named Centerville, because it lay between Farmington on the north and Bountiful on the south, and all 3 towns were in the county of Davis, state of Utah. They organized the first Mormon ward in 1852, known as Centerville Ward. The first bishop was Sanford Porter Sr. Ozias Kilburn and Simon Dalton were his counselors. In General Conference in Salt Lake City, April 1853, it was reported that there were at that time 194 souls in that ward. Whenever the Mormons who settle in the West from Nauvoo found a place to settle, it was their procedure to build a rock or stone wall or fort around the settlement as a protection against Indian attacks. Such a wall was begun in Centerville in 1853. Then later another fort was begun, but in 1854 neither was ever finished. When driven from Nauvoo, many of the people lost their records and had nothing to show as to baptism dates, etc. Also, many had become lukewarm. Therefore, the church carried on an extensive reformation for its people. Many adult members, as well as youngsters 8 years old and over, were rebaptized, and the record of each recorded new. Many had also become very lax and attended not their sacrament meetings. Sometimes during late 1853 and early 1854, it was learned by President Brigham Young that some Sabbaths were passed by with no meetings. On March 22nd, 1855, the bishopric of Centerville was reorganized and William R. Smith was made bishop, with Simon C. Dalton and Henry A. Cleveland as his counselors. It was early in 1857 that Johnston's army passed through the Utah settlements, including Salt Lake City, Bountiful, Farmington, and towns north on their way south to California. At the time, Sarah had been living with her Uncle William, and he, with all other residents and members of the church, feared the worst from the army. They had been warned that James Buchanan, the President of the United States, had ordered Johnston to chastise the Mormons, and they expected the worst. Now it is widely believed Buchanan hoped by doing so to weaken the cause of anti-slavery so pronounced in the northern states and all parts of the northern U.S. territories. This army was the best equipped and trained in the entire United States at that time. Just before their arrival, the saints, in an entire body, packed all they could into their wagons, boarded up their homes, and left only a few guards in each town with instructions to set fire to every building if the army began any plundering at all. It was known as the scorched earth policy. The Centerville folk, then numbering over 200 souls, were assigned to go to Spanish Fork. Actually, it was in Provo that Thomas William first caught sight of Sarah, and at once felt a great attraction toward her. He learned that she was a widow, and was determined to court her. The people from Salt Lake were stationed in Provo. Sarah with her uncle and the others were there, but she did not remember him, nor meet him formally until they were back in Salt Lake. Early in 1858, the army arrived in Salt Lake, but made no permanent camp there. They passed through the valley and camped farther south in a place called Cedar Valley. We now know that Brigham Young obtained a promise from General Johnston through his representatives that none of the people's property would be molested. They kept this promise, though the army stayed there for many weeks. Before the outbreak of the Civil War, the army was recalled from Utah. Then, and some families before this time, returned to their homes along the Wasatch Front, between Ogden and Salt Lake. It is most interesting to note that General Johnston actually became one of the leading generals in the army for the South against the North in the Civil War. Yet he was an honorable man and kept his word with Brigham Young, and no Mormon homes were ever molested. After the gold discovery in the early 1850s, there was a great influx of prospectors with families, some without, that had passed through the valley on their way to California. This was actually a godsend to the Mormons all along the Utah Trail, since many of the immigrants were forced to abandon or sell very cheaply much of their heavy loads in order to cross the great desert between Utah and California. The saints brought anything they thought they could use and paid for it in food such as salt pork, grain, and dried fruits that they had raised, etc. Farm equipment such as plows, anything too heavy and taking up too much room in the wagon, was thus sold and became a blessing to the struggling settlers. Even some furniture was obtained. David F. Smith, son of William R. Smith by his fourth wife, Eleanor Felshaw, a native born child of Centerville, in his short history of Centerville tells us that after the first 10 years of the Mormons' entry into the Salt Lake Valley, more than 30,000 head of livestock had been driven across the plains to the valley by the Mormon pioneers. The pioneers made adobe brick from a certain clay they found in damp areas of the land and dried them in the sun and constructed homes from them. A few are still standing after 100 years. Many also gathered rocks, which were indeed plentiful, and made very permanent homes from them. Many of these are still in use to this day. They were industrious and thrifty as a whole. They had to work hard in order to survive at all. The training Sarah had received on the Sims farm was of lasting benefit to her, and she put it to use constantly. During waking hours, her hands were never idle. Once she said to me, "I love to work. There are some things I like to do much better than others, but I'd rather do any kind of work than nothing at all." Soon after they were settled in Centerville, she persuaded her husband to spade up a portion of the backyard, and she planted corn, beans, a few peas, the only seeds she was able to obtain. Then her friend Mary gave her some hollyhock and larkspur seeds, which she planted next to the pole and post fence that enclosed the property running east and west on which they lived. She was a never-ending source of amazement to her husband, who had never seen ladies work inside and outside as did she. He remembered his own mother in England, when he was still at home, had servants to do the work, and had never worked physically unless it was her wish. But he soon learned that pioneer women were different. They had to work to survive. Sarah was very meticulous about her person. She brushed her hair and braided it, or wound it into a bob each morning after washing her face and hands before preparing breakfast. Her clothing was always clean and often mended, but never ragged or sloppy looking. Her house was kept up the same way, though she admitted she'd rather do almost anything than routine housework, because it never stays done. You just have to do it over and over again. It was she who milked the cow night and morning. Her husband had never learned the art, but he used tools for building with real craftsmanship and made all types of furniture. She also had a fine sense of business and of planning. She knew what she wanted and was never on the fence. Once she decided what should be done, she worked toward that end. He greatly admired her for her quick sense of wit and humor and for her business ability. Once, when wishing to compliment her, he said, "Really, my dear, you are so very smart. You should have married a dumbbell." "Well," she quipped, with a twinkle in her eye, "maybe I didn't miss it so far after all." They both laughed. He was careful not to let her natural sense of humor, bordering at times on sarcasm, annoy him. Instead, he always laughed with her, even at himself. He had no sense of insecurity. He had guarded against feeling put down by sharp retorts from whatever source. He would not quarrel with anyone. Rather would he refuse to answer or walk away if he thought it best to do so. Her respect for him grew as she lived with him day after day. He was kind, considerate, and even thoughtful of her. But what really drew her to him was his treatment of little Will. Love for him sneaked up on her unawares, almost before she knew it. Gone was that hard, tight knot in her heart which had closed her senses for marital affection for so long, and she softened toward him. Then gradually came a deep and great love. "I'm going to make a trundle bed for this boy," he said, as he tried to fit the child into the swinging cradle, which he had outgrown. They had been in Centerville only a week, but the next day he went in search of wood up into the canyon and gathered wood from the growing trees that he would need. So were the log cabins built from logs from the mountains and foothills, while a mile to the west were the borders of the Great Salt Lake. It sometimes receded in dry seasons so that it was farthest west. The land was not so fertile close to the lake, and the settlement was sort of tucked under the great lofty Wasatch Mountains that guarded over it, and the sister villages along the Wasatch Front, as though they had been reared there by the hand of the Almighty for that very purpose. Sarah loved the mountains. Her husband came to care for them also, though he had never seen their like so close at hand. They filled some folk with sense of awe, overwhelming them because of their massiveness. Not so with Sarah. She loved them from the first. Brigham Young knew what he was doing when he had our people settle in this glorious valley, she told her husband. It's as though we were placed in the ever-loving and protecting arms of God. That's the way I feel about our mountains. And you're right, he agreed. You make me feel that same way. Sarah was delighted with the trundle bed. It was ever so much larger than that little cradle. It could well accommodate 2 half-grown children, and fit snugly under their own double bed during the daytime, and was drawn out at night for the boy. He even carved 4 little wooden casters, so it would roll in and out more easily. "Now," he said, as she gave her warm approval of his handiwork, "you can get rid of the cradle, sell it, or give it to someone who needs one." "I'll think about that," was her response. Next morning the cradle had disappeared, and he didn't ask what she had done with it. Actually, she had folded it flat, as when it came to her, and carefully fitted it under the bottom part of the new trundle bed, and secured it there with strong strips of carpet rags she had been saving for a woven carpet. "Who knows? I may need it again some day," she told herself. The days and weeks flew by, and it was September. Mary's baby was due soon, but she was determined to have a party in her new home first. "I was invited," Sarah told me, "and told that it would be in the evening, and I was to bring my husband. We went and had the best time. I can still remember the fun of it all. I had one the very next weekend and invited them to my house. So we made our own pleasure, with our husbands when possible. Without them, if they were gone, or otherwise engaged," she told me. After Sarah's party, Mary, then huge with child, went out early the next evening to milk their cow. It either kicked or somehow knocked her over, and she was thrown into labor because of the fall. Her husband happened to be near, saw what had happened, picked her up, and got her into the house. The midwife, Mrs. Wadoops, was sent for. They worked with the patient all night and all the next day. Finally, the midwife delivered one infant, and it was dead. Still, the agony went on. Finally, a second infant was delivered. It, too, was dead. Still, the patient was in dreadful labor, and the hours dragged on. Sarah heard of the distress of her friend, and leaving little Will with her husband, went to see if she could help in any way. As she entered, she noted Mary's husband in the far corner of the room, wringing his hands helplessly, and the midwife trying unsuccessfully to ease the sufferer. Sarah took one look at Mary, then rushed over to the husband. "She needs a doctor. She will die very soon if you do not get one." She then approached the bed and took over from the now helpless midwife. Mary's husband bounded out the door, and in seconds was in his cart with his best horse. He drove like mad to Salt Lake City, and was back in an unbelievably short time with Dr. Seymour B. Young. Mrs. Wadoops, in the meantime, had gathered up her belongings and sailed out of the house, very disgusted at the turn events had taken. Sarah bathed the patient's face in cool water. Then bending over her, she spoke firmly but with confidence. "Mary, I'm here with you now. Try not to struggle. Take deep breaths and hold on to my hands. Your husband has gone for the doctor, and he'll be back very soon. I'm going to stay right here with you through the night. Now be strong and take courage. There is one more baby, I'm sure of it, and it's alive. I can feel it move when I press your abdomen." "Sarah, it's you," came the tired, weak voice from the bed. "Yes, Mary, don't struggle if you can help it. Try to lie as quiet as you can. Save your strength till the doctor gets here." Unbeknown to her husband, Sarah had brought her tiny bit of brandy she had left over from when her child Will was born. She had kept it hidden from sight. "I don't tell my husband everything," she explained. "Then he'll have less to worry about. But Mrs. Moore, the midwife, that taught me what I know, always, when possible, made her patients what she called a sling, and that's what I'm fixing for you. Mary, here, I want you to drink every drop of this." Mary was too weak to resist, and only half comprehended what was said. She was still in frightful pain, and had been in labor over 36 hours. She drained the glass obediently. Short after, the doctor and her husband arrived. It was Dr. Seymour B. Young. The following is what happened, told in Sarah's own words. The doctor brought out with him a bottle of chloroform. I had never seen or smelled the stuff until then. There on the head of the bed were 2 towels tied, one on each side of Mary, as this was the custom. When the pain got real bad, the patient could pull on these to help the labor along. Most poor Mormons never had anything to help ease their pain, but the doctor did not have her use these as Mrs. Wadoops had done. He simply put her to sleep and took that baby with instruments. And that's the first time I ever saw a baby delivered with instruments. He knew exactly what to do and was very efficient. At first, Mary would not take the chloroform. "If you don't," the doctor told her, You'll be dead in a very few minutes." So she took it. The baby was a beautiful little girl, lively and well as could be. But all the time the doctor was working over Mary, her husband sat in the far corner of the room and wept and wrung his hands, saying, "If you'll only save her life, I swear I'll never get her that way again. It's all my fault, my fault." "No," retorted Dr. Young. "Well, you just wait. In about 14 months from now, you'll be sending for me again. Perhaps 'twill be twins next time." Sarah continued, "The great thing to me was that he saved her life and the baby's." He then packed up his equipment into his bag and started out to his rig, when I noticed a small pool of blood on the floor. It was dripping from the mattress on which Mary lay. As the door closed behind the doctor, Sarah jumped up, placed a bowl to catch the blood, and ran out to the doctor as he was climbing into his buggy. She reached up and clutched him by the sleeve. "You must come back, doctor. She's hemorrhaging badly." Then she continued her story. We rushed back into the house, and when he saw her condition, he pulled off his coat, rolled up his sleeves, and went to work. He kneaded her abdomen for a half an hour and got all the remaining afterbirth missed before, and at last was able to check the flow of blood somewhat. As he put on his coat, Brother Smith went up to him to pay him. He handed him a $20 gold piece and said, "Here, take your fee out of this." Dr. Young looked at him and said, "My fee is $25, but as you seem to feel so bad about parting with it, I suppose this will do." Sarah spent the night with Mary, watching by her bedside while the tired, frail little body lay stretched at peaceful rest in the huge bed. The effects of the chloroform kept her in a dazed stupor part of the night. Then came natural sleep, and Sarah felt that the danger had passed. She bathed and dressed the baby girl in the clothes that Mary had laid out before those terrible hours of her great ordeal. Brother Smith, finally stretched out on the couch beside the bed, had slept also. Mrs. Wadoops did not return. Sarah nursed Mary until she was able to be up and around. She'd get up early, do what had to be done at home, and feed her husband an early breakfast. Taking her child with her down to Mary's house, she'd bathe the baby and Mary, feed her patient, and did all that was necessary. Sometimes she'd walk back to her house in the middle of the afternoon while Mary and the baby slept. Then she'd go back, give them their evening care, and back home for the night. Mary got along without further complications. She named her little daughter Mary Ellen. "That was the most perfect child I ever saw," declared Grandmother Sarah to me all those years later when she lived with me. "She never gave her parents one more of trouble or worry, and her disposition was just ideal. Everyone loved her. She grew up, married, and had a fine family, and I don't think she ever had an enemy in this world." And that's it for today's reading. Even though the story is now being told as more of perspective from the interviewer, the author of the book, there still are quite a few big twists and turns to Sarah's story. And I love that there's a lot of history tied into this, so you learn things along the way. I think it's really exciting. I love history. I love Utah history, and I especially love history about the area where I live. I'm the only member of my immediate family who lives in Davis County. Prior to college, I had never really known anybody who lived up this way. The furthest we would ever travel north is Lagoon. So beyond Lagoon, I never knew anything else really existed. It wasn't until my sister went to college at Weber State, and then I shortly followed after high school, that I started to spend time in northern Utah, past Lagoon. So this is always a place that I just wanted to live. It felt like home, and so I've been here ever since. I've lived in Davis County for 23 years. And so when I learned about my great-great-great-grandmother's story and how she lived in this area, I was extra excited. And so I always felt like I had this special connection to her story because I live here. So This has been a lot of fun. Anyways, I'd love to hear your thoughts about today's chapter. I'm starting to edit the documentary. I can't wait till we get to the end of the book so you can finally see all the extra things that I discovered during this time. So that'll be a lot of fun. Anyways, I hope you have a Merry Christmas. I hope you enjoy the holidays. And I'll see you next week for another chapter.